Sometimes the pride we take in things creates an insatiable desire to improve just that little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. Sometimes the vision we have extends beyond our talents, and we find false hope and fake help, trying to turn an idea into something grander than it has to be. All when, sometimes, it's better as a shit show. So, as one flawed human to another, with all my love, Refrigerate After Publishing presents the Saturday Morning Shit Show. I guess now it's time to dance my little monkey dance. Very well.
Thanks everyone for joining our inaugural episode of the Saturday Morning Shit Show. Our first season will focus on No Capes, First in Flight. This 15-part 15?
Yeah, 15. We're going chapter by chapter.
You're serious? Even though they could buy the first 2 volumes of No Capes on Amazon right now, then they wouldn't have to listen to...
Cole, will you just read the script?
Well, that's how it starts, but Mr. Casket will take no more. Rise up, my fellow appliances, for the hour is at hand.
Where are you going? I guess I'll do... Even in a world with infinite possibilities, there are no capes. Here's The Burden 216, Chapter 1, In Another Place and Time. Don't bother trying to actively absorb the following flood of information. You're better off letting these contextual truths fall from view like a burnout musician. Although, should you be the type to believe that a narrator wouldn't go about wasting words, then believe me as I paint you a picture of a distant, yet eerily familiar land. Better yet, allow me to take you there. First, through a sampling of history, some of what I know. Then, through the lens of a handful of characters caught somewhere just before being called hopeless parodies. Imagine, then, if you aren't already, that you exist in but one relatively small patch of space-time that has stopped expanding. Outside of your patchwork universe, space-time continues to expand at a rate that we can never hope to comprehend, much less traverse. However, within these blind eternities lie an infinite number of patchwork universes. Many are like our own, many more are far different. It is difficult, then, to rationally say that anything within this sprawling void is near anything else. What is near suddenly becomes less about distance and more about similarity. Your universe's neighbor may be the difference in one man's barely consequential coin toss. With that in mind, the story contained within these pages doesn't come from the universe next door. It's in the neighborhood, though. For now. Let's go, then, to a dirty hovel placed on a small farm in China, the 19th century waiting impatiently for its time with mankind, a time greatly separated from the interconnectedness of modern communication, yet not all that long ago. The turmoil currently affecting the ancient nation didn't matter to the farm's owner, not as he watched his beloved partner fight for her life. She was supposed to have given birth over a month ago, but for weeks there had been no signs of labor. Until tonight, as thunder roared and the rain came down in relentless sheets. Her contractions had started several hours ago. Her clear decline started soon after. It was far too wet for the farmer to go for help. Even if he were to try, visibility was lethally poor. Instead, he was forced to watch, terror gripping his chest, the strength with which she gripped his hand fading further. With all the will she could muster, his wife proclaimed something that sent the farmer rushing to the space between her feet. He expected to see ahead, and was eager to welcome some light into a dark and horrific day he could only pray wasn't on the way to bleak hopelessness. What he saw instead when his wife gave her a final push was anything but what was expected. The farmer's hands had been outstretched to catch his first child and welcome it into the world, but recoiled reflexively as he laid his eyes on what was emerging. It was his own flesh and blood, but there was little else that could be said to describe it. The child lacked nearly everything. Without a face, limbs, skeletal structure, or even someone to catch it on entry, the blob-like being plopped down onto the filthy floor. Backing away slowly, the farmer barely registered his wife taking her last breath. The near silence that followed haunted him for the rest of his life. Though there was clearly life in the newborn, it was missing the facilities to cry out. He wished it had been born dead, that the horror inherent in this tragedy might have been tempered. Unfortunately, the horror show had only just begun, as somehow impossibly it inched its way across the dirt towards the man that would have been its father, flesh squelching along the ground. When his back met with the wall of his shack, the farmer became frantic. Soon he felt his hand brush against a woodcutter's axe. His child had only kept closer, his form creating two short appendages. It sought only the attention and safety that any newborn would crave. The child reached out, a strange facsimile of the farmer's facial features forming in the space between the thing's stubby tentacles. His father wrapped its hand around the axe, raising it above his head. He looked to his wife's limp form, remorse painted clearly across his visage. Then he looked down at the creature who had killed her. Remorse rapidly morphed into wrath and rage. The axe, ignorant of the difference between splitting wood and severing flesh, plunged through the air without a care in the world. It didn't take much time. The farmer only needed to give the anomaly born from his genes a couple good whacks before it had stopped moving entirely. Suddenly, it felt as if his only recourse was to burn it all down. All reason had escaped him as he piled all of his worldly possessions into a fire at the center of it all. The farmer was prepared to throw himself into the growing inferno, yet the smoke-choked room proved too much, and he collapsed mere feet from the pyre. The flames rose steadily, a house glowing from within, preparing to challenge the torrential downpour surrounding it. As it began to consume his late wife and monstrous child, the farmer felt the depth of his loss, but not the totality of it. Slowly, his vision blackened and he lost consciousness. He wanted to burn with them that night, to be reduced to ash along with his love and all of their worldly possession. Instead, he awoke when the sun rose, surrounded by the smoldering ruins of his life. Coughing through near-suffocated lungs, he regarded the divine and asked why he must be cursed with such horrific loss. And because they did not answer, he believed the child's death to be their doing, rather than accept the blood on his own hands. The farmer wandered for many years, dying on his feet propped against a train car awaiting the departure whistle. Yet even as he breathed his last, he failed to grasp that his loss weighed heavier on the world than it could ever weigh on one man alone. Now, that's not to say that the child had any chance of surviving to adulthood and passing its genes along, but Mother Nature was trying to prepare us for something. She kept trying, too. The next few decades played hell on any attempt evolution made to walk forward. With the birth rate something like 10 in a billion, these malformed children were born into families from every walk of life. Each one quietly dealt with in a slightly different way. Whether you were born with scales and no fingers in the basement of a tenement house only to be drowned in the sewers, or perhaps a furred royal infant surviving to the age of 3 in your own wing of a manor before succumbing to the pains of your very existence. Be they impoverished secrets or living myths, the truth of these stories all died with time. Still, the emergent gene refused to die out, consistently sharpen itself, becoming something more tolerable. It was in the 1920s when a young American couple gave birth to a bird. Yes, a bird. For it would be improper to call this child man or monster. From here on, the stories are known, but a story isn't always true. Yet, all too often, The fiction is easier to believe. Hawk, though. Hawk was more than a story. He was a legend. It was a matter of hours after the bird boy's birth before his previously panicked parents made the decision to silently leave the hospital. The local medical community was at a loss for what to do with the child, so he sat in a warm hospital cradle like any other newborn would, albeit for quite a bit longer. Though he was far from content in the man-made nest he found himself in, often filling the maternity ward with odd squawking cries, he was smaller than your average newborn, significantly so. Anyone who could push down their disgust and take the time to pick him up would immediately remark on how frail and light the strange little one was. Every test they could run at the time for a newborn's senses seemed to point to the boy being blind. Perhaps most problematic, though, was the beak-like cartilage that had continued to harden, gradually becoming something closer to bone, a complication that made both soothing and feeding the child nearly impossible. Dr. Paul Harlan was a young idealist who had only been at the hospital for a few months. Most of the last month he had been fascinated by the newborn they had been keeping separate in room 216. The entire building was so strange at that time. For every nurse or doctor that skirted through the maternity ward making the sign of the cross, there were 3 medical professionals from out of town that came by to observe the colicky half-bird. Dr. Harlan had been there for all of it, taking every opportunity, often staying late, to be the one at the boy's side. The doctor had come to expect the shocked looks of other professionals that stopped by to peer into 216. What had become consistently off-putting to him was the increasing trickle of well-dressed men who didn't seem the least bit surprised to see such an anomaly. Word was spreading, and so was the pit in Paul's gut. That night was quiet. Dr. Holland had managed to get the child to eat a couple hours ago, and he now seemed to be sleeping peacefully. However, given he had yet to open his eyes, it was hard to tell for sure. There were things that Paul alone seemed to be able to do for the boy. At times it felt to him like to everyone else the little boy was just a horrific accident of nature. To Paul, though, each step seemed so obvious. When it was time for the newborn to eat, he had to be propped up and fed a kind of paste that he had worked with a wet nurse to develop as quickly as possible. His method of comforting the child was far more human, though. It was as simple as wrapping him in a blanket tightly enough so that he couldn't move and holding him while humming a tune. Paul hoped that the prevalent aversion to getting close to the child was due to its clear frailty, but he knew it was deeper than that. At the end of the day, they were afraid, even if they didn't understand why. That much was clear when, even after 2 weeks, everyone still referred to it as the bird in 216. This is what bothered Dr. Holland the most. It felt so terminal, or worse, like the boy was some pest caught in the hospital's air ducts. He was not a social man, and though he only ever spoke it aloud when he was alone with the anomalous newborn, Paul came to know the child as George. George, who had found something in the awkward intellectual he would have never expected to possess, a father's instincts. As he felt himself reluctantly drifting to sleep, he smiled down at the newborn, who had long since beaten him to slumber, with no more than the occasional whimper. He didn't hear it open, but his eyes flew open when it closed. Paul whipped his head to look at the door, just in time to see a man walk past the small window. Not a man wearing doctor's whites, rather something that was almost a dark business coat. A yellow banded fedora perched atop his head. Paul's heart sank as he turned his head slowly to where George had been sleeping. The boy was still there, though his blanket seemed to be wrapped a bit looser. His pulse returned to normal, and he settled back into a more familiar level of uneasiness. No, it was deeper than that. Something was wrong. Dr. Harlan began to reconsider his notion of taking the newborn away. It had first occurred to him only days before when he caught a glimpse of a shiny badge one of the suits had failed to conceal completely. Taking care of George himself was not a concern. His own father had immigrated young and continued the family's banking interests here in America. Though Paul's decision to go into helping people rather than money itself had been a disappointment to his father. The man had passed years ago. The young doctor had long since told himself that he had no reason to be concerned with his old man's disappointment any longer. Mostly in those moments, he found himself clutching his father's timepiece, lost in thought. His mother, however, would call occasionally when she found the strength. Paul was a miracle to his parents, already late in their years when he was born. Deep down, he knew that the people he was really trying to help by getting into medicine were his own parents. Memories of their descent into old age start as early as his teenage years. For weeks, he had been wondering if it might be time to head home and take care of his elderly mother. Suddenly, the variables slid into place. With more and more suits poking their heads in, he knew his time to act had to be closing, as well as his time with his mother. Dr. Harlan made up his mind then. The sun rose in the window as he regarded the door warily. Family was the only choice. "It's time for us to go home, George," Paul said as he stood up and faced George in his nursery of one. Leaning down, he was just about to lift the infant from where he slept when, to his elation, George slowly blinked. What Paul saw in his son's piercing yellow eyes as they took in the world for the first time wasn't a frightened babe. His look was the solemn determination of a fledgling, eagerly awaiting the day it's able to fly. Then he dropped a bird shit in his diaper that was half his body weight, the determined look quickly fading into beak neutrality. "I guess we'll go after we get you cleaned up and I raid this room for supplies." Dr. Harlan chuckled lightly to himself as he set about changing George's cloth diaper. Dr. Harlan had little trouble getting the two of them out of the hospital, and even less boarding a train headed out of state. As the locomotive got up to speed, George slept in Paul's lap, finally able to understand comfort, despite his fragility. The doctor, however, was paranoid. Sitting in the public boxcar, he was barely able to stop himself from jittering anxiously. He didn't have much money, but he put it all towards the best one-way ticket he could buy, leaving behind most of his possessions along with his small apartment. This decision to spring for a higher class of escape was quickly seeming foolish. There were suits everywhere. Paul wondered how he was supposed to tell an industrialist from a government official. He feared that at any moment someone would flash a badge and take George from him. At once he realized that stealing a baby, abandoned or not, might even get local police looking for him. Nervous, he began to sweat when suddenly a lithe shadow loomed over him.
"Are you okay, sir? You seem unwell,"
came the soft voice of the woman behind him. She was blonde and wearing a gray suit. From Paul's panicked perspective, her eyes seemed hard and searching, almost hateful. "You a cop?" Dr. Harlan asked without thinking, looking for a glint of metal hidden in the woman's clothes. After a short, disconcerted laugh, she answered, her face seeming friendly now.
"No, sir. I'm with the train. I'm wondering if I might take your coat, perhaps bring you a glass of water."
Paul relaxed considerably then, from forehead to asshole, all the way to his toes, making a mental note of how long it had been since he had slept in an actual bed.
"Yeah, I suppose it is warm in here. And we are in for a bit of a ride."
"Sure, just let me get this." He trailed off as he thought of how difficult it would be to get his coat off without waking little George. Of course, he could just hand him off to the valet for a moment. Paul regarded the stranger and suddenly felt his sense of trepidation returning. On second thought, I'll just take the water for now.
"As you wish, sir."
She walked off, moving quickly and returning a short time later. Handing Dr. Harlan a glass of water, she nearly tripped over the doctor's only luggage as she approached.
"Thank you." "It's no problem, sir, but if you could stow your luggage under your seat while in the observation car, I'm sure all the other passengers would appreciate."
"Sure. Sorry about that." Paul took a long gulp from the water before setting it down on a nearby table. Without warning, the valet leaned over and pulled the shade to the window up. Around the same time, a mixture of passengers, valets, and maids pulled the shades up on most of the other viewing windows. All at once, it seemed a lot brighter. George began to stir. Dr. Harlan feared the child might wriggle enough to expose his abnormalities through his blankets.
Thank you for riding with us.
The valet started to walk off. Paul tried to get George a little more nestled into the crook of his arm before stopping her.
Excuse me, how long until we reach Georgia? Just short of 2 days. Will there be anything else?
She was starting to seem a little impatient, like she had other, more important duties to attend to.
How are me and the little guys supposed to sleep in this car for 2 days?
After Dr. Harlan asked her this, the valet briefly looked at him like he was stupid.
Sir, you'll find the number to your sleeper car on your luggage tag.
Oh, right. Now the young doctor felt quite dumb, but any other trips he had undertaken on the rails had been short, cheap, or both. The valet walked off to tend to whatever else she had on her to-do list. Paul thought it would be best to find their sleeper now and get settled in. With George starting to coo softly in his one-armed embrace and their luggage in the other hand, Dr. Harlan stood up.
All right, George,
Paul said as he looked down at the blanket, bundled tightly around the boy's strange form and loosely over his face.
Let's make our way to...
Paul glanced down at the tag on the luggage. As the big red letters stared back at him, his heart sank.
216.
Frantically, he considered the likelihood that they knew something. He decided it had to be a coincidence. He leaned down a bit to get a better look at the tag.
Huh. I guess that's 21-6.
Paul found that neither logic or misunderstanding made him feel any better. They found car 21 without incident, and compartment 6 was right there as they walked into the car. There was nothing extravagant about their sleeping quarters, but it made good use of its space. A bed big enough for Dr. Harlan to sleep in comfortably, with a shelf above it on one side and a small dresser of sorts on the other. Paul struggled for a moment to figure out how he and George could sleep in the bed without the risk of the infant being crushed. An idea soon came to him after setting their luggage down. George only now starting to show signs of discontent from where he rested in the doctor's arms. Paul reached across the bed and grabbed the single pillow, opened the dresser's middle drawer until a portion of it rested on the edge of the mattress, and placed the pillow snugly inside.
One last thing,
Dr. Harlan said as he turned around and locked the door.
now.
He sat down on the bed and regarded the soft chirps and grunts from the small bundle in his arms.
I think we can breathe for a bit.
Paul gently pulled the blanket from around George and laid him on the bed. The boy quieted quickly as his bestial eyes devoured everything they could see, his lack of neck strength the only deterrent to his curiosity. Dr. Harlan could tell, even before running a gentle finger over the child's face, that the lower half had continued to harden and take shape. The process had been happening faster and faster since he first noted it a couple of days after George's birth. He seemed to be feeling better by the day, though, so Paul tried not to let it bother him, choosing to observe. George was still prone to the occasional screaming fit, and it was an unearthly noise. Fortunately, these seemed to only come if he squirmed with too much enthusiasm or bumped against something. Undoing the safety pin holding George's diaper on, Dr. Harlan was careful around the thin and loose membrane that appeared to connect the child's wrists to just above his waist. His hands were perhaps the most human characteristic he had, and even those, along with most of the rest of them, were growing a gray down coat. Of course, then there was the matter of George's feet. It occurred then to Dr. Harlan that if George were to develop foot problems, that he would be better off visiting a veterinarian than a podiatrist. There was an ill-defined divide somewhere on the boy's legs between calf and ankle. Under it seemed to get increasingly dry in a way Dr. Harlan had never seen before. Rather than the feet one might expect, though, George had 3 impossibly long toes and an oversized heel attached to the end of each of his legs. "You are magnificent." Paul smiled down at the boy as he finished pinning a clean diaper on George. He bundled the child back up and set him down in his makeshift drawer crib. Paul then began to take inventory of their luggage in earnest. Almost immediately, his moment of reprieve was cut short. Pulling out what small amount of George's food paste he had managed to free from the hospital, he spoke to no one in particular.
2 days.
He knew it wouldn't be enough. Frustrated, he moved to the compartment's window and peered out, fields and farmland whipping past. Without giving it any thought beforehand, Dr. Harlan opened the window and tossed the nearby dirty diaper out as hard as he could. Very briefly, a frightened cow could be heard before the distance from the diaper's impact site was too great. A look of slight regret flashed across Paul's face before he closed the window. Dr. Harlan sat down on the bed and began the process of spooning the pale paste into George's waiting mouth. He would know they were done when George closed his mouth and opened his eyes. By the time that happened, the little bird boy had gone through even more of his food than Paul had anticipated. He put the rest of the paste away and tucked their luggage on the rack above the bed, all the while thinking that the excitement of their escape and a full belly should have the baby asleep soon, and for some time. Before pulling the blinds closed, Paul lamented that he allowed himself to get so upset he threw literal shit. His attention turned back to his bed and the one he had made for his boy. He was exhausted. That was undeniable. Any problems the two of them may have to face will still be there after a few hours of sleep. The doctor leaned over George, who was already dozing off, and whispered, "May cooler heads prevail, dear one." Then he kissed the child's forehead and tossed his coat in a corner before settling into a surprisingly deep sleep.